Before we begin this story, tell me in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is in your part of the world right now. I always love imagining these stories reaching people in different cities, different countries, and different quiet corners of the night. When people looked at Eleanor Whitmore, they saw a woman made of marble. They saw the silver sweep of her hair, always pinned with deliberate elegance. They saw the expensive coats, the guarded eyes, the cool way she entered a room and immediately made everyone straighten their backs. In the coastal town of Greyhaven, where old money and newer greed lived side by side behind iron gates and manicured hedges, Eleanor Whitmore was not simply rich, she was a monument, a name, a woman whose signature could save a business or bury it. What people did not see, what almost no one cared to remember, was the girl she had once been. At 19, Eleanor had lived in a drafty apartment above a butcher's shop with peeling wallpaper and one narrow bed she shared with a dream bigger than her circumstances. Her father had died under the weight of factory debt. Her mother had worked herself into an early grave, taking in laundry from wealthier households. Eleanor learned young that hunger had a smell, that humiliation had a sound, and that pity was often more insulting than cruelty. Back then, she had not worn silk. She had worn the same brown coat through 3 winters, sewing the lining herself each year so no one would see how threadbare it had become. She met Charles Whitmore in those years, before the empire, before the headlines, before the polished photographs in business magazines. Charles was a carpenter's son with calloused hands and impossible confidence. He had eyes full of plans no bank would fund and no respectable family would support. He wanted to build not just homes, but places people would cross oceans to remember, hotels with soul, properties that made people feel as if their lives had turned beautiful for a little while. "You look at broken things like they insult you personally," Charles had once told her with a grin, the first time he saw her argue with a landlord over a leaking ceiling. Eleanor had folded her arms and replied, "That's because I don't intend to spend my life beneath one." He laughed then, and she remembered being annoyed by how much she liked the sound of it. They married with almost nothing. No grand wedding, no family blessing worth mentioning, no inherited safety net. Eleanor sold the last gold bracelet her mother had left so Charles could buy materials for a renovation contract that other men had turned down because the building was too damaged and the profit too uncertain. "You don't have to do that," Charles had said that night, staring at the empty velvet box on the table. "Yes, I do," Eleanor answered. "It was your mother's. And if I keep it in a drawer while we starve, then it becomes grief, not love." There was no dramatic music when they built their lives. There was no miracle investor descending from the heavens. There was only work, relentless work. Charles repaired floors by day and sketched building concepts by night. Eleanor took bookkeeping jobs, cleaned furnished rentals, negotiated with suppliers, and learned to read contracts so carefully that later even seasoned lawyers would be wary of underestimating her. When Charles shook hands, people liked him. When Eleanor reviewed documents, people feared her. It became their balance. His warmth opened doors, her steel kept them from being cheated once inside. Their first major breakthrough came 10 years into marriage when a storm-damaged inn on the cliffside above Greyhaven went up for auction. It was an absurd risk. The roof had caved in, the plumbing was ruined. Most called it a rotting carcass with a sea view. Charles looked at it and saw a crown. Eleanor looked at the numbers and saw ruin, until she also saw that if they succeeded, they would never be powerless again. "We can lose everything," she said, standing in the ruined lobby while rainwater dripped through the broken ceiling. Charles stepped beside her. "Then let's lose it chasing something worthy." Eleanor turned to him slowly. "That is the most irresponsible thing you have ever said, but not the least convincing."
She tried not to smile. She failed. They bought the inn.
For 2 years, they worked beyond exhaustion. Eleanor managed creditors who spoke to her like she was overreaching. Charles supervised labor with a fever more than once because he refused to lose momentum. They fought, they loved, they nearly collapsed. But when the Whitmore Cliffs Hotel opened, lit golden against the sea, the town that had once dismissed them had no choice but to notice. From there, the rise was steady, though never easy. One property became three, three became seven. Eleanor developed an instinct for location, timing, and negotiation that bordered on ruthless precision. Charles handled aesthetics, hospitality, and expansion design. Together, they built not just wealth, but reputation. Years passed, seasons folded into each other. Greyhaven changed. So did they. And in the middle of their rise came Vanessa. By the time their daughter was born, Eleanor had finally begun to taste a kind of safety she had once believed belonged only to other women. Vanessa came into a home with sunlight, warm blankets, polished floors, and a future already widening before her. Eleanor looked at the baby and felt something frightening in its tenderness. Love that deep felt like weakness. It felt like a hostage situation arranged by the heart. Charles, meanwhile, was transformed by fatherhood in ways that softened the house. He carried Vanessa through the hotel gardens at dusk, showed her how to listen to the sea when storms were coming, let her pull at his tie during business calls. "Don't make her afraid of mistakes," he once told Eleanor when Vanessa was 7 and crying over a piano recital she had fumbled. "I'm making her strong." Charles shook his head gently. "There's a difference." But Charles did not live long enough to keep balancing them. When Vanessa was 14, Charles died after a sudden cardiac event during a business trip in London. One phone call split the family cleanly in two, life before, life after. Eleanor flew across the ocean a wife and returned a widow. She buried her husband in black silk and did not cry in public. Greyhaven admired that. People always admire restraint when they do not have to survive inside it. After Charles died, something hardened permanently in her. She still loved Vanessa. In many ways, she loved her more fiercely than ever. But grief twisted love into vigilance. Eleanor began to see danger in softness, disaster in carelessness, humiliation waiting around every corner for those who relaxed. She corrected Vanessa more sharply. She scheduled her more rigidly. Excellence became expected. Emotion became untidy. Vulnerability became something to endure alone. Vanessa, who had once run laughing through hotel corridors, became quieter at first, then more rebellious, then brittle. "I got second in class, Mother," she said once at 16, standing in Eleanor's study with a report card trembling slightly in her hand. Eleanor barely glanced up from the ledger on her desk. Then, next term, aim for first. Vanessa's face fell. "That's all?" Eleanor lifted her eyes. "Would you prefer I applaud mediocrity?" That night, Vanessa cried where no one could hear her. Years passed, and the distance between them ceased to be accidental. It became habit, then structure, then almost language. Still, Eleanor told herself everything she did was necessary. She had not clawed her way out of hunger just to raise a foolish heir who would let opportunists devour the family name. She gave Vanessa the best schools, the best tutors, the best travel, the best introduction society could offer. If affection came less easily than provision, then so be it. The world was crueler than any mother's tone. By Eleanor's early 60s, the Whitmore empire stretched across boutique hotels, luxury real estate, and restoration projects in both the United States and parts of Europe. Her board obeyed her, her competitors studied her, younger women in business called her legendary when she wasn't present, and intimidating when she was. But legends are often lonelier than ordinary people realize. Eleanor lived in the Whitmore estate overlooking the water, a house large enough to echo. The rooms were tasteful, immaculate, and far too quiet. Vanessa, now grown, visited less often than politeness required, and never with some undertone of tension. When she did come, conversations were brief, careful, and armed. One autumn evening, as rain tapped softly against the tall windows of the estate library, Eleanor sat with a glass of untouched brandy while her longtime housekeeper, Miriam, arranged correspondence. "You should rest, Mrs. Whitmore," Miriam said gently. "You've been reviewing contracts for 3 hours." Eleanor did not look up. Rest is what men call inactivity when women stop working long enough to notice what is missing. Miriam gave her a knowing glance. "And what is missing tonight?" For a moment, Eleanor's pen stilled. Then she said, quieter than before, "My husband, my daughter, the version of myself that still knew how to speak without sounding like a verdict." Miriam's expression softened, but she said nothing. In that house, silence was often the most respectful form of witness. Outside, the rain continued. Inside, Eleanor straightened another stack of documents and returned to work, because work was the only language that had never abandoned her. She did not yet know it, but the empire she had built from hunger, grief, endurance, and pride was already becoming the stage for a family reckoning years in the making. Not tonight, not yet, but the fault lines were there, hidden beneath polished floors, waiting. Before we continue, tell me in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is in your part of the world right now. I always find it remarkable how one story can travel across different countries, different clocks, and different lives all at once. By the winter Eleanor Whitmore turned 63, the Whitmore estate had become brighter than ever and colder than anyone admitted. Preparations for her birthday began weeks in advance, not because Eleanor loved parties, but because in her world, appearances were a form of governance. A Whitmore gathering was never simply a celebration, it was a display of order, relevance, and control. The guest list included investors, local officials, old family friends, journalists disguised as acquaintances, and several European business contacts tied to the company's latest acquisitions. The chandeliers were polished, the silver commissioned, the floral arrangements imported, and every room in the estate was adjusted until it looked effortless enough to pass for elegance. Eleanor oversaw all of it with her usual precision. "Those roses are too open," she told the event coordinator in the ballroom, glancing at a crystal vase. "By evening, they'll look tired. Replace them." The woman quickly nodded. "Of course, Mrs. Whitmore." "And move the string quartet farther from the west arch. The acoustics bounce awkwardly there." "Yes, Mrs. Whitmore." Nothing escaped her eye. Not the angle of the place settings, not the lighting along the staircase, not the slight stain on a linen runner that no one else had noticed. Miriam, who had worked for Eleanor long enough to read the mood beneath her silence, stood beside her in the dining room as staff carried in polished glassware. "You are more restless than usual," Miriam observed. "I am observant, not restless." Miriam gave her a dry look. "That is what you call it." Eleanor adjusted a candle holder by half an inch. "There's a difference." But there was something different in the air, and they both knew it. It had begun months earlier, in fragments too small for other people to notice. Vanessa arriving late to lunch with new diamonds and an old resentment in her eyes. Adrian speaking too casually about succession structures over brandy after dinner. Strange calls that ended when assistants answered. Quiet movements in the accounting departments of two family-controlled entities. Requests for early trust access disguised as strategic concerns. Little things. The sort of little things Eleanor had built an empire by taking seriously. Vanessa and Adrian lived in a house 20 minutes from the estate, one paid for partly through Whitmore family arrangements and partly through Adrian's own polished image as a rising financial advisor. Outwardly, they were exactly the sort of couple magazines liked. Beautiful, educated, well-dressed, internationally connected. But by the time Eleanor's birthday approached, the shine had begun to crack. Vanessa had started spending with a hunger that did not look like pleasure anymore. Designer pieces arrived and were hidden. Bills were rerouted. A vintage car had been purchased and then sold again within weeks. Adrian, meanwhile, had become sharper in ways that were difficult to prove but impossible to ignore. He asked careful questions that looked harmless on the surface. If something happened unexpectedly, he had asked one evening at dinner, cutting into his lamb with graceful calm, Would the company remain under a single voting structure, or would the inheritance branches divide operational control? Vanessa had laughed too brightly. Adrian, must you turn every meal into a finance seminar? But Eleanor had watched him. There are attorneys for those questions, Eleanor replied. Adrian smiled. Naturally, I only meant that clarity protects families. Greed also likes clarity, Eleanor said evenly. That is why one must be selective with it. Vanessa's jaw tightened at that, and dinner continued in brittle politeness. After that evening, Eleanor did what she always did when intuition stirred. She verified. Quietly, carefully, without drama, she began having certain matters reviewed. Not through scandal-loving outsiders, and not through anyone whose loyalty could be bought. She relied on old methods, discreet legal inquiries, background checks through trusted professionals, private audits, conversations with people others ignored, drivers, former assistants, old banking contacts, a retired barrister in London who still owed her late husband a favor, a forensic accountant in Boston whose daughter's tuition Eleanor had once paid anonymously after the girl's mother died. The findings did not arrive all at once, they accumulated like cracks under ice. Adrian had losses larger than his public image suggested. There were leveraged risks, hidden debts, private loans arranged through offshore structures, and at least 2 forged authorizations intended to position him near assets he had no lawful claim to. He had been careful enough that nothing alone looked catastrophic, but together the pattern was unmistakable. He was not simply ambitious, he was cornered. Worse than that, he had been working on Vanessa. At first, Eleanor refused to believe the full extent of it. However damaged their bond had become, some stubborn and wounded part of her still wanted to think her daughter could not truly drift into malice. Resentful, yes, reckless, perhaps, gullible even, but not cruel. Then one rainy afternoon, Miriam entered Eleanor's study carrying a tray of tea no one had asked for, which meant she was bringing more than tea. "There is something you should hear," Miriam said softly. Eleanor looked up from the papers spread across her desk. "Go on." Miriam hesitated. Peter spoke to one of the younger groundsmen. The man was in the service corridor last week when Mrs. Hale and her husband were arguing after dinner. He only heard pieces, but he is certain of the tone. Eleanor's face remained still. What pieces? Miriam lowered her voice. He heard Mr. Hale say, "If she lives another 10 years, there will be nothing left for us but permission slips." He also heard your daughter say, "Then maybe I'm supposed to keep waiting until I'm old too." The room was silent for a moment. Rain pressed against the study windows. Somewhere farther down the hall, a clock ticked with insulting steadiness. Eleanor leaned back slowly in her chair. And the groundsman told Peter this voluntarily? Yes. Did he embellish? I don't think so. Eleanor folded her hands. Thank you, Miriam. Miriam did not leave at once. Do you want me to call Mr. Sutton? Mr. Sutton was Eleanor's lead attorney, a man with the expression of a disappointed eagle and the temperament of a locked safe. Not yet, Eleanor said. Miriam studied her. You're calmer than I expected. No, I'm simply old enough to know that panic is a luxury for people with less to lose. In the days that followed, Eleanor's calm became more deliberate. She met with Mr. Sutton, she reviewed inheritance documents, she examined trust provisions that had been drafted years earlier, then amended after Charles's death, then amended again when Vanessa married Adrian. There were clauses no one but her attorneys fully understood. Emergency powers, contingency transfers, freeze mechanisms, charity routes, protective structures intended for corporate sabotage, kidnapping, incapacity, fraud. She had built layers into her empire because she had never trusted life to stay kind for long. Now she began activating certain safeguards, not publicly, not dramatically. Quiet amendments were prepared, selected holdings were repositioned, copies were sealed, Witnesses were arranged for the upcoming birthday gathering under the harmless excuse of legal and philanthropic announcements tied to her age and legacy planning. A private toxicology consultant was retained under non-disclosure. Security camera coverage at the estate was expanded and checked twice. "Do you believe they may try something at the party?" Mr. Sutton asked during one late afternoon meeting. "I believe desperate people like symbolism, and birthdays make the old seem closer to death than they are." Mr. Sutton's mouth flattened. "That is a grim observation. It is also correct." Yet, even as she prepared, there remained one part of her that was not made of marble at all. It revealed itself unexpectedly on Thursday before the party, when Vanessa came to the estate alone for a fitting related to the guest reception. She stood in the blue drawing room wearing a pale tailored dress and looking for a flicker of a second, almost like the girl she had once been. "You always make this place feel like a museum," Vanessa said, glancing around. "It becomes one when people stop living honestly inside it." Vanessa let out a brittle little laugh. "There you are. I was wondering how long it would take." Eleanor looked at her daughter carefully. "How long what would take?" "For you to turn a sentence into an accusation. I didn't accuse you of anything." "You never have to," Vanessa snapped. "You just look at me as if disappointment is my natural scent." Something in the room shifted. The seamstress quietly withdrew with her pins and measuring tape, leaving mother and daughter alone in the kind of silence that had destroyed more families than shouting ever did. Eleanor set down the guest list she had been reviewing. "If you have something to say it plainly." Vanessa's eyes shone, but not with softness. "Plainly? Fine. You never forgave me for not becoming a second version of you." "That is absurd." "No, Mother. What was absurd was growing up in a house where every compliment had conditions, every mistake was a prophecy, every weakness was treated like moral failure." Eleanor straightened. "You were given every advantage, and none of your tenderness." The words landed harder than Eleanor expected. For a brief second, she saw not the expensive woman before her, not the resentful heir, but the 14-year-old girl who had lost her father and then lost the softer version of her mother in the same season. But Vanessa went on before that recognition could become mercy. "You still think you're the only one who ever suffered?" she said. "You carry your poverty like a saint carries a relic. You make everyone kneel before what you survived." Eleanor's voice cooled. "Survival is not something I display for applause. It is the reason you had a better life than I did." Vanessa smiled without warmth. "Did I?" When she left the estate, Eleanor remained in the drawing room long after the door closed behind her. She stood very still, staring at the space Vanessa had occupied, and for the first time in years, she let herself admit that whatever this family once was, it had already begun to rot long before money made it visible. Saturday evening arrived with expensive candles, winter air, and a sky the color of dark steel beyond the estate windows. Cars rolled up the drive one after another. Guests entered in velvet, black tie, diamonds, satin. The quartet played softly beneath the stair landing. Champagne moved like gold between trays. Laughter rose in practiced waves. People kissed cheeks, praised the view, admired the arrangements, and whispered their usual assessments of status, age, and decline. Eleanor descended the staircase in deep wine-colored silk, with a diamond brooch Charles had given her decades ago when they could barely afford it. The room turned, as rooms always did when she entered them. She greeted people with polished composure. She accepted compliments. She observed everything. Then Vanessa arrived. She wore ivory with emerald earrings. Adrian at her side looked immaculate, his expression smooth, his smile perfect. To anyone else, they were a handsome married couple attending a matriarch's birthday. To Eleanor, they looked like a storm dressed for dinner. Vanessa crossed the room and kissed her mother's cheek. "Happy birthday, Mother," she said. "Thank you," Eleanor replied. Adrian took Eleanor's hand lightly. "You look extraordinary tonight." "I prefer useful over extraordinary." He smiled. "You have always managed both." The guests moved toward the dining hall. Candles flickered against crystal. Place cards guided the hierarchy of the room. Toasts began, formal at first, then affectionate, then strategic, as such speeches often were in wealthy families. Eleanor spoke briefly, thanking her guests with grace and measured wit. Her words were well received, but she was not distracted by praise. She was watching Vanessa. Her daughter was unusually attentive that night, too attentive. She refilled Eleanor's water before the staff could. She adjusted her napkin. She touched her shoulder with public warmth that felt almost theatrical. Adrian watched all of it with the careful stillness of a man who needed an outcome and could not afford a misstep. Then, halfway through the final course, Vanessa stood for her toast. The room quieted at once. She lifted her glass, smiled with startling tenderness, and began to speak about sacrifice, motherhood, legacy, and the cost of greatness. Several guests dabbed their eyes. Even Eleanor, listening beneath the polished phrases, had to admit her daughter had chosen her words well. Too well. And when Vanessa turned at last, lifted a fresh glass of red wine and walked toward her mother with hands that trembled almost imperceptibly, Eleanor understood with complete and terrible clarity that the night had arrived. Before we continue this story, tell me in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is in your part of the world right now. I always find it fascinating to think that while one person is listening late at night with the lights off, someone else somewhere may be hearing the same story in the middle of a bright afternoon. When Vanessa Whittemore Hale raised the glass of red wine toward her mother that evening, the entire dining hall seemed to sharpen into stillness. The candlelight trembled across crystal and silver. The quartet in the adjoining room had just fallen silent between pieces. A few guests smiled softly, believing they were about to witness a rare reconciliation between a difficult mother and her elegant daughter. Adrian, seated near the end of the table, held his expression in place with the discipline of a man who needed an outcome and could not afford a misstep. Eleanor remained seated, one hand resting lightly beside her plate, the other near the stem of her untouched water glass, her face unreadable. Vanessa's voice was warm, almost tender. "To my mother," she said, lifting the wine slightly higher. "No matter what has stood between us, tonight is still a celebration of the woman who gave me life, protected our family name, and built something the world could not ignore." A few guests murmured approval. One older woman gave a little sigh, visibly moved. Another guest nodded, as if this were the emotional climax of the evening. Vanessa stepped closer, her smile polished, her eyes shining in a way that could easily have been mistaken for emotion and not strain. Then she leaned in. To everyone else, it looked like a daughter drawing near to offer a private word to her mother on a sentimental occasion. But Eleanor heard the truth as clearly as if it had been shouted across the hall. "Hurry up and die, old hag." The words were soft enough that only Eleanor heard them, but the hatred inside them was loud enough to split years open. For one suspended moment, Eleanor did not move. She looked up at her daughter, the daughter she had carried, clothed, educated, and hardened with the misguided conviction that discipline would save her, and saw a face both familiar and foreign. Vanessa's lips still wore that elegant smile for the benefit of the room, but behind it lived resentment that had grown roots far deeper than Eleanor had fully allowed herself to believe. Then Eleanor did the last thing anyone expected. She smiled. Not a trembling, broken smile, not the bewildered smile of an old woman trying to pretend she had misheard. It was small, composed, and deliberate, the kind of smile that suggested not surrender, but certainty. She accepted the glass. "Thank you, Vanessa," she said, her voice calm enough for Vanessa's fingers to twitch. Around them, the guests relaxed, unaware that the air had already changed. Vanessa stepped back half a pace, her breathing a little shallower now. Adrian's attention sharpened with predatory focus. Eleanor lifted the wine, looked briefly at the deep red surface, then brought it to her lips and took a measured sip. A chill passed through the room, though no one could yet name why. Vanessa's throat moved as she swallowed. Adrian leaned ever so slightly forward. At the far end of the room, Miriam, standing with the staff near the service entrance, went pale but kept her posture steady. Mr. Sutton, seated among the guests under the harmless appearance of a long-time legal advisor invited for the birthday, did not react outwardly at all. He simply removed his napkin from his lap and set it carefully beside his plate, as though preparing for business. Eleanor returned the glass to the table. Then she said, clearly enough for everyone to hear, "I suppose now is as good a time as any." The room quieted in confusion. Vanessa blinked. "Mother?" Eleanor turned her gaze toward the gathered guests. "My apologies, ladies and gentlemen. I had intended to save my announcement until dessert, but I find that some surprises should not be delayed." A nervous ripple of laughter moved through the room, uncertain and quickly dying. Adrian smiled faintly, but Eleanor saw the warning flare in his eyes. She continued, "For several months now, I have had reason to believe that certain individuals close to me were attempting to manipulate inheritance structures, conceal private debts, and create conditions under which my death might become financially convenient." This time, no one laughed. Vanessa's color drained so fast it seemed to disappear under the candlelight itself. Adrian rose halfway from his seat. "Eleanor," he said with just enough concern in his voice to sound rehearsed, "surely this is not the moment for one of your dramatic suspicions." Eleanor did not look at him. "Sit down, Adrian." The command landed with such natural authority that for an embarrassing second he obeyed before realizing he had done so. The room had gone utterly silent now. A fork clinked faintly somewhere as one stunned guest set it down too quickly. Near the entrance, 2 members of the household security team appeared as if by coincidence, though Eleanor knew better than anyone that coincidence had not been permitted inside this evening. Vanessa let out a breath that sounded almost like a laugh. "Mother, what are you doing?" "What I should have done years ago, seeing clearly." She reached beside her chair and lifted a slim leather folder. "Before tonight began, samples were taken from a duplicate glass prepared at exact serving sequence requested by my daughter. I arranged this after receiving troubling indications that sentiment had become the preferred disguise of desperation." Vanessa stared at her as if the floor had shifted beneath her feet. Adrian stood halfway from his seat. "Eleanor," he said with just enough concern in his voice to sound rehearsed, "surely this is not the moment for one of your dramatic suspicions." Eleanor did not look at him. "Sit down, Adrian." The command landed with such natural authority that for an embarrassing second he obeyed before realizing he had done so. The room had gone utterly silent now. A fork clinked faintly somewhere as one stunned guest set it down too quickly. Near the entrance, 2 members of the household security team appeared as if by coincidence, though Eleanor knew better than anyone that coincidence had not been permitted inside this evening. Vanessa let out a breath that sounded almost like a laugh. "Mother, what are you doing?" "What I should have done years ago, seeing clearly." She reached beside her chair and lifted a slim leather folder. "Before tonight began, samples were taken from a duplicate glass prepared at exact serving sequence requested by my daughter. I arranged this after receiving troubling indications that sentiment had become the preferred disguise of desperation." Vanessa stared at her as if the floor had shifted beneath her feet. Adrian stood halfway from his seat. "Eleanor," he said with just enough concern in his voice to sound rehearsed, "surely this is not the moment for one of your dramatic suspicions." Eleanor did not look at him. "Sit down, Adrian." The command landed with such natural authority that for an embarrassing second he obeyed before realizing he had done so. The room had gone utterly silent now. A fork clinked faintly somewhere as one stunned guest set it down too quickly. Near the entrance, 2 members of the household security team appeared as if by coincidence, though Eleanor knew better than anyone that coincidence had not been permitted inside this evening. Vanessa let out a breath that sounded almost like a laugh. "Mother, what are you doing?" "What I should have done years ago, seeing clearly." She reached beside her chair and lifted a slim leather folder. Before tonight began, samples were taken from a duplicate glass prepared at exact serving sequence requested by my daughter. I arranged this after receiving troubling indications that sentiment had become the preferred disguise of desperation. "No," Eleanor said, finally turning to him. "I am humiliating the guilty because they mistook my age for helplessness." Then she nodded once toward Mr. Sutton. Like a curtain being drawn, the legal machinery Eleanor had prepared began to move. Mr. Sutton rose from his chair and addressed the room with solemn professionalism. At Mrs. Whitmore's instruction, sealed packets were placed at each seat before dinner. Several guests startled and looked down. Few had noticed the slim envelopes tucked discreetly beside their programs. "You may open them now." Paper rustled hesitantly through the hall. Inside were copies, not gossip, not claims, but records. Debt summaries, transaction trails, email extracts, forged authorization attempts, offshore borrowing documents, communication logs. Enough to freeze the room in disbelief. One investor muttered, "Good Lord." Another whispered, "Is this real?" "It is documented," Mr. Sutton answered, "and copies have already been provided to the relevant authorities." Vanessa's hands began to shake openly. "Adrian," she whispered. He did not look at her. Eleanor spoke again, and this time her voice carried not just control, but the cold sorrow of a woman who had run out of illusions. "My son-in-law has, over the past year, accumulated extensive financial liabilities concealed beneath layered entities and deceptive reporting. He has also made repeated attempts to position himself near assets that are not, and were never, lawfully his to control." Adrian scoffed, though the sound broke at the edges. "Circumstantial interpretation." "Would you like me to continue with the forged signatures?" Eleanor asked, "or the debt leverage in Geneva, or perhaps the private messages in which you suggested that my prolonged life expectancy was a barrier to liquidity?" A sound like a swallowed gasp moved across the room. Adrian's face hardened. For the first time that evening, the polished mask slipped enough for everyone to glimpse the contempt beneath it. "You think you're victorious because you hired better spies?" "No," Eleanor said. "I think I am alive because I paid attention." Vanessa turned to him, horrified. "You told me none of that would ever be traced." The instant the words left her mouth, she seemed to realize what she had admitted. A woman near the center of the table put her hand over her mouth. Someone else rose from their chair entirely. The room no longer resembled a birthday dinner. It resembled the scene after a collision, still, stunned, full of people whose lives had just separated into before and after. Adrian's voice dropped. "Vanessa, stop talking." But Eleanor was already watching her daughter, and what she saw there was not only guilt, it was panic. It was weakness. It was years of grievance sharpened into stupidity by a man who knew exactly where her bitterness lived. Vanessa's eyes filled. "You were never supposed to—" "To what? Notice? Survive? Refuse to die on schedule?" Vanessa took a shaky step back. "You don't understand." At that, something fierce flashed through Eleanor. She rose from her chair, not quickly, not theatrically, but with controlled strength of someone who had no intention of collapsing for anyone's comfort. "On the contrary, I understand tonight more than I have in years." She looked around the hall at the assembled faces, associates, opportunists, old acquaintances, people who came for elegance and found exposure instead. Then she returned her gaze to Vanessa. "I understand that I built an empire because I knew what it meant to be powerless. I understand that after your father died, I mistook hardness for protection. I understand that grief made me severe. But do not stand in my house and pretend your choices were born tonight. They were fed, watered, rehearsed, and carried here in a glass." Vanessa's mascara had begun to blur at the corners. "You made me feel like nothing unless I was useful." "And so you decided I should become nothing unless I was dead?" The silence after that question was brutal. Even Adrian had no immediate answer to offer her. Eleanor set her hand lightly on the back of her chair and nodded once toward the side entrance. "The police are already on the grounds. They were instructed to wait unless needed earlier. I had hoped, foolishly perhaps, that tonight might force honesty before it required consequence. I see now that consequence arrived first." Vanessa spun toward Adrian fully then, desperation cracking through her poise. "Do something!" His face changed with terrifying speed. The charm vanished, the husband vanished. All that remained was a cornered man calculating survival. "Do not drag me down because you lost your nerve." She stared at him as if struck. "You said it was the only way." "You said many things," he snapped. "Unlike you, I didn't sip the poison." Gasps broke across the hall. Vanessa let out a sound halfway between a sob and a laugh of disbelief. In one savage sentence, he had handed her to ruin in order to step half an inch farther from it himself. Eleanor saw it all: the betrayal, the exposure, the last collapse of Vanessa's illusions, and for the first time that evening, she felt not triumph, but exhaustion. This was the true grave in the room, not the one Vanessa had wished upon her, the one built slowly over years by pride, silence, entitlement, poor love, and greed. Mr. Sutton stepped forward. "Mrs. Whitmore, shall I proceed?" Eleanor gave a small nod. The guests were quietly asked to leave the hall and reassemble in the adjoining salon until statements could be taken. Some moved eagerly, hungry for scandal. Others looked shaken enough to forget their coats. The staff worked with astonishing discipline, removing glasses, securing documents, closing side doors. Miriam remained close, her face taut with anger and grief. As footsteps and whispers receded, Eleanor remained standing at the head of the table, while Vanessa and Adrian, no longer a glittering couple but two exposed conspirators, faced the wreckage of what they had done. Then, Eleanor spoke one final sentence before the authorities entered. "From this night forward, neither of you will ever control what I built." And for the first time in many years, she did not feel like a woman waiting for the next blow. She felt like someone who just survived the worst one. Before we continue this story, tell me in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is in your part of the world right now. I always like to imagine these stories traveling across different homes, different cities, and different late-night hours, finding people who understand pain, survival, and the strange ways a life can begin again. 2 years passed after the night Eleanor Whitmore refused to die on anyone else's schedule. Time did not heal everything. It did something more realistic than that. It moved. It forced consequences to ripen. It stripped away illusions one season at a time until the people left standing could no longer hide behind the versions of themselves they had once sold to others. For Eleanor, the first year after the birthday scandal had been brutal in ways that the newspapers could never fully understand. The press had treated the story like a feast. Greyhaven society had done what privileged circles always did when another wealthy family cracked open in public. They acted horrified while privately savoring every detail. Articles appeared in financial columns, legal blogs, society pages, and international business journals. Some accounts portrayed Eleanor as a cold matriarch whose emotional failures had finally come home to punish her. Others cast her as a nearly murdered titan who had outmaneuvered a predatory son-in-law and a morally ruined daughter. Few accounts got close to the truth, because the truth was less elegant than scandal. It was uglier, more intimate. It contained not only crime, but history. During those early months, Eleanor hardly slept. She kept working, of course, Work had always been the first language of her survival, but now the work was different. She was no longer merely protecting an empire. She was deciding what kind of future deserved to exist after the family she had built it for had nearly poisoned her for it. One rainy morning, she stood with Mr. Sutton in the long gallery of the Whitmore estate, looking out toward the cliffs where the sea struck stone with relentless patience. "The restructuring documents are ready. If you sign this set, the Greyhaven estate begins transfer into the new foundation entity by quarter's end." Eleanor kept her eyes on the water. "And the board?" "Concerned, naturally, but your control remains intact." "And the objections from the family branches?" Mr. Sutton gave a faintest trace of dry amusement. "The relatives who appeared suddenly concerned about legacy after reading the papers." "Yes." "Good. They have no standing worth discussing." Eleanor nodded once. "Good." Mr. Sutton studied her profile. He had known her long enough not to mistake quiet for peace. "You are certain this is what you want?" She took the documents from him and looked down at the pages. The Whitmore Foundation, a structure unlike the family trusts that had once dominated her estate planning. A new legal future for a fortune built out of hunger, endurance, and greed. Mr. Sutton, being a lawyer of disciplined instincts, did not respond to the philosophy. He simply handed her a pen. Eleanor signed. That was how the second life began, not with music, not with applause, not with some dramatic sunrise of emotional closure, but with ink, rain, and a widow deciding that inheritance would no longer mean surrendering her life's work to the nearest relative with the right last name. The Whitmore estate changed gradually after that. The grand property overlooking the sea remained her residence, but parts of it were transformed with deliberate purpose. One wing that had once housed guests during society weekends was converted into offices. Another became temporary housing suites for women emerging from abusive marriages, financial ruin, or widowhood without support. The old carriage house was redesigned into a training center for bookkeeping, hospitality administration, property operations, and legal literacy. Eleanor insisted that if the foundation was going to carry her name, it would not become a sentimental vanity project for donors to photograph. It would teach women how not to be devoured. "I don't want pity programs," she told the foundation's first executive staff during their opening strategy meeting. "I want competence, housing, training, legal support, employment pathways. If a woman leaves here still dependent on the mercy of people who despise her, then we have failed." One younger administrator, eager and polished, smiled brightly. "That's incredibly empowering." Eleanor looked at her over the rim of her glasses. "No, it is practical. Empowerment is what people say when they want to sound inspired. I am interested in results." Miriam, seated near the end of the table in her new role as Foundation Operations Director, hid a smile behind her hand. What surprised the town most was not that Eleanor had survived, nor even that she had turned the scandal into institutional reform. What surprised them was that she appeared stronger after the betrayal than she had before it. The rigid widow who had once seemed carved out of old grief began to change at the edges. She still dressed impeccably, she still ran meetings like military campaigns wrapped in silk, she still reduced arrogant men to silence with a single raised eyebrow. But something in her had loosened, not into softness exactly, but into truth. She laughed more often, though always briefly. She walked the gardens at dusk without carrying reports. She began taking meals on the terrace instead of at her desk. Sometimes, when staff passed her study in the evening, they heard music playing low from inside, old records Charles had loved. And then there was Daniel Mercer. He returned to Greyhaven in the spring of the second year, though in Eleanor's mind he did not feel like someone returning. He felt like a chapter she had folded closed decades earlier and then forgotten existed. Daniel had been one of the architects who worked with Eleanor and Charles during the difficult years before the Whitmore name became untouchable. He had designed expansions, drawn plans by hand in the old office when budgets were thin, and argued with Charles late into the night over stone facades, terraces, window height, and guest flow. Back then, he was quietly brilliant, inconveniently perceptive, and far too decent for the ambitions of some of the men around them. He had also loved Eleanor once, though he had never tried to take what was not his. After Charles died, Daniel gradually disappeared from the business orbit. Some said he left because Eleanor became impossible. Others thought he simply wanted a life that did not require surviving her grief. Whatever the truth, he went on to design cultural restorations across Europe, married no one, and became the sort of man whose name circulated in professional circles with understated respect. When he arrived at the estate again, it was at Miriam's suggestion, though Eleanor suspected Daniel himself had not needed much persuasion. The foundation needed a consultant for the restoration of the old carriage house and the East Garden Annex. Daniel happened to be in Massachusetts for a lecture series. Miriam happened to mention the opportunity through an old contact. And one pale April afternoon, Eleanor found him standing in the entrance hall, coat in hand, silver now at his temples, his expression carrying the same calm intelligence she remembered. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Daniel said, "You still make a foyer feel like an examination room." Eleanor stared at him, and to her own surprise, she laughed. "It appears age has not improved your caution." "No, but it has improved my timing." They began with work, because work was the safest territory either of them knew. Daniel reviewed plans, walked the grounds, and asked questions no one else thought to ask. He did not flatter Eleanor. He did not pity her. He did not behave as though the scandal had made her fragile, nor as though her wealth made her beyond ordinary conversation. He spoke to her the way very few people still could, as if she were fully human and entirely capable of being contradicted. "The training center should have larger windows on the south wall," he said one morning as they stood over blueprints in the old library. "That will require reworking the stone lines." "Yes. It will cost more." "Yes." Eleanor looked up. "You are enjoying this?" "A little." She narrowed her eyes. "Why?" "Because for the first time in 30 years, you are listening before arguing." She set down her pencil. "That is an outrageous exaggeration." Daniel smiled. "Not outrageous, merely overdue." There was no youthful rush between them, no foolish pretending that late-life tenderness must look like a second adolescence. What grew between them was slower than passion and deeper than performance. He walked with her through the gardens in the evenings. They spoke of Charles without awkwardness. They spoke of failure, legacy, age, travel, regret. Sometimes they sat in silence while the sea darkened below the cliffs, and Eleanor found that silence with Daniel did not accuse her of anything. One evening, as they stood beneath the pergola overlooking the water, Daniel said quietly, "You know, people always called you intimidating, but that was never the whole of it." Eleanor folded her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "What was the rest?" He looked out at the horizon. "You were frightened that if you stopped holding the world by the throat, it would take everything from you again." She said nothing for a long moment. Then, because he had earned honesty by not demanding it, she answered, "It did take everything from me, more than once." "Yes," he said, "but not everything stays gone." That sentence stayed with her for weeks. While Eleanor's life was changing, Vanessa's was collapsing into something unrecognizable from the glossy life she had once performed. Her legal outcome, after months of negotiation, public disgrace, and cooperation with investigators, spared her the harshest penalties Adrian ultimately faced. She had not masterminded the financial architecture. She had not drafted the concealed debt mechanisms or engineered the offshore concealments. But she had participated in attempted poisoning, and no elegant surname could wash that clean. Her sentence was reduced because she testified extensively, because Adrian's counsel tried and failed to paint her as the sole architect, and because the evidence made plain that he had spent months inflaming every grievance she carried. None of that made her innocent. It only made her more tragically compromised. When she was released, the world waiting for her was not the one she remembered. No friends from the old social circles called. Invitations vanished. Brands that had once courted her avoided association. Even the women who had envied her wardrobe now crossed streets to avoid being seen in conversation with her. Adrian, meanwhile, fell far harder and farther. His financial crimes, fraudulent maneuvers, and role in the attempt on Eleanor's life destroyed him publicly. Disbarment proceedings began in one jurisdiction than others. His name became less a person than a cautionary example. Vanessa rented a small apartment in a dull building outside Boston under a variation of her married name, not because she wanted privacy, but because shame had become logistical. She worked temporary jobs at first: reception desks, boutique stockrooms, clerical overflow. She had never before understood what it meant for a paycheck to dictate not merely pleasure, but survival. One late autumn afternoon, nearly 2 years after the birthday dinner, Eleanor received a handwritten letter. Not an email through attorneys, not a formal request routed through intermediaries. A letter on plain cream stationery, with Vanessa's old school script handwriting, less confident now than it once had been. Miriam found Eleanor reading it alone by the library windows. "Bad news?" Miriam asked. Eleanor looked down at the page again. "No, worse than that." Miriam waited. "She is asking to see me." "And will you?" Eleanor was quiet long enough for the fire to crack softly in the hearth. Finally she said, "I don't know whether I want to see my daughter or the ruin of her." Miriam's expression softened. "Sometimes they are the same person. Sometimes they are not."
The meeting was arranged for a week later at the old greenhouse on the edge of the estate gardens, a place that had once been one of Charles's favorite winter projects. Eleanor chose it deliberately. It was neither courtroom nor drawing room, neither battlefield nor throne. When Vanessa arrived, she looked thinner, older than her years, stripped of the polished invincibility she had once worn like perfume. Her coat was plain, her shoes were sensible, her face held no makeup worth noticing. For the first time in perhaps her entire adult life, she looked like someone the world had finally refused to cushion. They stood facing each other among the dormant potted citrus and sleeping roses. Vanessa spoke first. "I'm not here to ask for money." Eleanor's face did not change. That would have been a short meeting. A shadow of old hurt passed through Vanessa's eyes, but she did not retreat from it. "I know." Eleanor waited. Vanessa's hands were clasped tightly in front of her, as if to keep them from shaking. When she finally looked up, there was no performance left in her voice. "Was there ever a point," she asked, "when you truly loved me more than the empire?" The question entered the quiet air like a blade, and for all Eleanor had survived, for all the lawyers, documents, betrayals, headlines, and hard-won victories, nothing pierced her so cleanly as that. Before we continue to the final part of this story, tell me in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is in your part of the world right now. I always find it moving to think that a story about one family's breaking and rebuilding can reach people in different countries, under different skies, at different hours, and still speak to something painfully familiar. For a long moment inside the greenhouse, Eleanor Whittemore did not answer. The late afternoon light fell in pale strips through the glass panels overhead, turning the dust in the air into a slow, suspended shimmer. Beyond the greenhouse walls, the estate gardens had entered the muted stillness of early winter. The roses had been cut back, the herb beds were sleeping. The sea wind moved faintly through the bare branches beyond the stone path. Vanessa stood a few feet away, thinner than Eleanor had ever seen her, shoulders drawn in as if bracing for impact. Her question still hung between them. "Was there ever a point when you truly loved me more than the empire?" It was not the kind of question that allowed elegant answers. It was not a question for lawyers, boardrooms, newspapers, or carefully managed family statements. It was the kind of question that reached past scandal and punishment and went straight for the oldest wound in the room. Eleanor turned slowly and looked at the row of terracotta pots along the far wall. Years ago, Charles had kept lemon trees there through the winter, fussing over them like fragile children. He had laughed whenever Eleanor called it sentimental. You can build hotels out of stone, but if there's no tenderness in the house, then all you've built is shelter. At the time, she had rolled her eyes. Now, standing in the same place with their daughter broken before her, the memory did not feel sentimental at all. It felt like an indictment that had arrived decades late. "Yes," Eleanor said at last. Vanessa's blinked, almost as if she had not expected an answer so quickly. "Yes," Eleanor repeated, turning back to face her fully. That is not the same as saying I loved you well." The greenhouse seemed to grow quieter around them. Eleanor drew a careful breath. She had spent most of her life speaking in language that controlled rooms, negotiations, and outcomes. But this required something else. It required plainness, the kind of plainness she had denied both herself and her daughter for too many years. "When your father died, I was terrified in a way I never properly admitted, not to you, not to anyone. I had spent my whole life fighting against helplessness, poverty, humiliation, the feeling that life could strip you everything from you while respectable people watched and called it unfortunate. When Charles died, I looked at you and saw not just my child, but the one thing left in the world that could be taken from me emotionally." Vanessa's eyes filled, but she said nothing. "I thought if I made you hard enough, disciplined enough, excellent enough, then nothing could destroy you. I thought love had to prepare you, sharpen you, make you impossible to crush."
Eleanor's voice remained steady, but only just. "What I actually did was teach you that affection was conditional, that approval had to be earned, that weakness was shameful. And when your grief met my fear, I turned our home into a place where neither of us was allowed to be human." Vanessa lowered her head. "I gave you schools, protections, introductions, opportunities," Eleanor went on, "and I congratulated myself for that. But children do not measure love the way balance sheets do. They measure it in tone, in warmth, in whether they are safe to fail without losing your regard." A tear slipped down Vanessa's cheek. She wiped it away quickly, almost angrily. "You always looked at me," she said in a strained voice, "as if I were one mistake away from becoming an embarrassment." Eleanor did not deny it. "Yes, that was my failure." Vanessa gave a jagged little laugh that broke halfway through. "You say it so simply." "No," replied Eleanor quietly. "It took me years to say it at all." The two women stood in the fading light, not reconciled, not healed, but stripped at last of pretense. Then Vanessa said the thing that perhaps mattered most. "I still chose what I chose." It was not a defense, it was not a plea, it was an admission. Eleanor nodded once. "Yes, you did." "I hated you for so long," whispered Vanessa, "and Adrian knew it. He found every bitterness I had and fed it until it sounded reasonable. He would tell me that you were never going to trust me, never going to step aside, never going to let me have a life that wasn't permission-based. At first, I thought I only wanted you humbled. Then I thought I wanted freedom. By the time I understood what I was becoming, I had already crossed lines I cannot uncross." Her voice shook now, but she did not hide from it. "When I said those words to you that night," she closed her eyes briefly, "I still hear them sometimes when I wake up." Eleanor looked at her daughter for a long time. She did not see innocence, that was gone. She did not see the polished, bitter woman from the birthday dinner either. What she saw was someone scorched by her own choices, someone who had finally run out of excuses and found beneath all the ruin the smaller and more terrible truth that she had helped carry herself there. Eleanor crossed to the work table near the center of the greenhouse and picked up a leather document case she had placed there before Vanessa arrived. Vanessa frowned faintly. "What is that?" "My final surprise," Eleanor said. Vanessa's expression tightened at the phrase. "Mother, this one is not meant to frighten you." She opened the case and removed several neatly arranged documents, then set them on the table between them. "I have rewritten everything," Eleanor said. Vanessa stared at the pages but did not touch them. "I assumed as much." "No," replied Eleanor, "not as much as you think." She placed her fingertips lightly on the top sheet. "The bulk of the Whitmore estate is now permanently committed to the Whitmore Foundation, not temporarily, not symbolically, permanently. The properties, the endowment, the operating structures, the expansion arms, tied to investment arms tied to family legacy holdings, everything substantial will remain in service of the Foundation's work." Vanessa gave a small, defeated nod. "That makes sense. But listen to the rest." Vanessa looked up. "There is a trust for you," Eleanor said. This time, Vanessa recoiled as if the words themselves were unbearable. "No. Yes. I don't want—" "It is not indulgence," Eleanor said sharply. "Sit still and listen for once without trying to perform either pride or shame." Vanessa's mouth closed. Eleanor continued, more gently now. "The trust is modest by Whitmore standards and generous by ordinary ones. It is not enough to return you to your former life. It is enough to ensure you are never destitute. Housing security, basic financial dignity, medical coverage, a small long-term reserve." Vanessa's eyes filled again. "Why?" "Because punishment and abandonment are not the same thing, and I have no desire to prove my own mothering failures by leaving my only child one illness away from ruin." Vanessa's eyes filled again. "After what I did?" "Do not confuse mercy with forgetfulness." Eleanor handed her the next document. "The trust has conditions, not humiliations. Conditions. It activates in stages only if you remain employed, sober, and free of financial fraud for a sustained period. There will be reviews, independent oversight, no advances, no manipulation." Vanessa looked down at the pages, her hands trembling now in earnest. "Then," Eleanor said, "and that is not the true inheritance."